Hello everyone and welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. We left off talking about the cell theory in the last video, and we said that all living things are made up of cells. So this video we're going to look at the different types of cells. So in biology we like to classify things. So cells can be broken down into two groups. The first is what we call the prokaryotes. And prokaryotes, I'm just going to abbreviate it as that, are cells that do not have a nucleus. I'm just going to write no. They do not have a nucleus. And then the other one is the eukaryotes. I'm just going to abbreviate it that. They do have a nucleus. So prokaryotes are the simplest of cells, and then eukaryotes are more complex because they do have a nucleus and they also have membrane-bound organelles. So they can be broken down into two groups, whether or not they have a nucleus and whether or not they have membrane-bound organelles. So prokaryotic cells, again, they are the simplest of cells. They range anywhere from 1 to 5 micrometers, as you see here on the screen. And one thing that you need to know is regardless of what type of cell they are, cells have three things in common. One is the cell membrane. All cells are going to have a cell membrane because remember, the function of the cell membrane is to control what comes into and out of the cell and also to protect it from its external environment. And then inside the cell membrane is a jelly-like substance that you should have learned in 7th grade, and that is cytoplasm. That jelly-like substance is going to help keep those organelles suspended in that material so that they don't collide and damage each other. It also is what I call a vegetable soup mixture because there's lots of organic compounds and materials that the cell is going to use to carry out different functions, and you're going to see the role that cytoplasm plays in things like cellular respiration, which is basically breaking down food that we eat to form ATP. Remember, we talked about ATP, the energy molecule that cells use for things like active transport, moving materials against the concentration gradient, and for other activities that you're going to learn in Unit 5. So it has materials to carry out the first part of cellular respiration, and then you'll learn about DNA replication and the role that it plays there. So all cells are going to have cell membrane. All cells are going to have cytoplasm. They're also going to have ribosomes. And ribosomes are organelles that create or synthesize protein. And remember, cell membranes contain protein, so you would need an organelle that would make those so that you would have that be available to the manufacturing of cell membranes. So prokaryotic cells, just know they are the simplest of all cells. They do not have a nucleus and they do not have membrane-bound organelles. Their DNA is simply floating around in the cytoplasm. You also need to note that it says here it is a single circular strand of DNA. So we have, as you should have learned in 7th grade, our DNA is in the shape of a double helix, and their DNA is in a circular single strand of DNA. So again, simple cells, 1 to 5 micrometers. They do not have a nucleus and they do not have membrane-bound organelles. And an example of an organism that is a prokaryotic cell would be a bacterial cell. So here is a typical prokaryotic cell. So some structures that you need to know. The pili here are these little structures that are coming out, and those are used for attachment. That's how the cell is going to attach to substances, and it's how they're going to attach and be able to get into your body. They're also used for conjugation. Bacterial cells can connect using those and then exchange genetic information. And then notice, obviously, you have the flagella here. They can have one or they can have multiples, and we're going to talk about flagella and what they're used for later. Notice also that outside of the cell membrane, they have a cell wall, and that is an extra basically layer of protection for the prokaryotic cell. And then some bacteria are going to have a capsule that is another layer of protection that would help fight off antibiotics and things like that. So notice again, ribosomes, all right, they have their DNA that's floating around here in the cytoplasm and cytoplasm. Those are basically the structures that we see in a prokaryotic cell, and we call this a nucleoid, which is just basically the area that contains their DNA, and you can see it here as a single little strand, circular strand of DNA. So eukaryotic cells, like I said, they are much bigger than prokaryotic cells. On average, they range from 10 to 100 micrometers. So remember, the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell is bigger than a prokaryotic cell. And eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, which means they have a membrane that encases their genetic information to protect it. And then we also have membrane-bound organelles. And membrane-bound organelles are things like mitochondria, chloroplast, lysosomes, all of these that we're going to talk about later. And eukaryotic cells can be broken down into two main categories, and we talk about animal cells and plant cells, and we're going to compare those later in this unit. So eukaryotic cell, they do have a nucleus, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. So you see those pictured here in the screen. So you have your nucleus, so notice the nuclear membrane here, which would hold your DNA. DNA would be in here, and then you have membrane-bound organelles. So this is an example here. This is the mitochondria. This is a Golgi apparatus, which we'll talk about later. These are probably vacuoles or lysosomes, again, which we'll talk about later. So they are much more complex cells than prokaryotic cells. So organelles, if you looked at the definition for organelle, it literally means little organ. So organelles inside a cell carry out specific functions. And like I said, prokaryotic cells do have some organelles, things like cell membrane, ribosomes, cytoplasm, and that's basically the extent of the organelles that they have. And then eukaryotic cells have lots of organisms, organelles that carry out specific functions for the cell, which we're going to talk about later in another video as to specific organelles and the functions that they do. So eukaryotic cells, like I said, they can be broken down into two main categories. That would be animal cells and plant cells. And if you notice on the picture here, you can notice some differences between an animal cell and a plant cell. So typically we think of plant cells as being rectangular or square in shape, and that is because of the cell wall. Cell wall is something that plants have and animal cells do not. We have a backbone, and bones to help add support to our bodies, but plants don't have those. So the cell wall basically serves that function for them. It's a thick layer that adds basically some structural support and also protection for the plant cell. Also, you notice here that plants have chloroplasts, these little green-like structures here that you see here drawn in. And you should have learned in 7th grade that chloroplasts are where photosynthesis takes place. So it makes sense that they would have that organelle and we don't, because we do not do photosynthesis. And then for a long time, it was believed that plant cells had vacuoles and animal cells do not. But we now know that plant and animal cells both have a vacuole. It's just in plant cells, as you see here, it is a large central vacuole, and when this is full, it creates basically turgor pressure, which is going to allow the plant to stay upright. So if you've ever seen plants that people forget to water, they start to wilt, they get droopy, and that's because the vacuole has basically become very, very tiny and doesn't have the pressure to keep it upright. So plant cells have chloroplasts, they have a cell wall, and they have a large central vacuole. Animal cells are going to have a vacuole, we now know that, but they're going to be very tiny structures, and we're going to have lots of them. So we just have like a couple little vacuoles here that a lot of times were overlooked because they were so small, but we do now know that animal cells also have them. And then one thing that's not drawn on this picture is that animal cells have what we call centrioles, and centrioles, you'll see them drawn in to pictures. To me, they look like little logs, and usually they're kind of like in this arrangement here. And centrioles, you're going to learn in Unit 8, are organelles that plant cells do not have, but animal cells do, and they play a role in cell division. So when we get into mitosis, you'll see that they help form the mitotic spindle, and you'll see how that works. So differences between eukaryotic plant cells and animal cells. Plant cells have a chloroplast, they have a large central vacuole, they have a cell wall, and their shape is traditionally square or rectangular because of that cell wall. And then animal cells, their shape is varied. You'll see in some slides here in a minute the differences in animal cells. And then we have very small vacuoles. They're pretty numerous in animal cells. And then animal cells have centrioles and plant cells do not. So one of the things you're going to be asked to do is to compare and contrast prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So you have the traditional Venn diagram, and for me it's difficult to write in those, so I usually just do two squares that overlap. So over here on the left, this would be my prokaryotes. Alright, so I'll go ahead and write that up there in case you want to copy this down, which I would strongly advise that you do, because that's something you're going to need to know for a short answer on your test. Alright, so prokaryotic cells, they are simple cells. They do not have a nucleus. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. An example of them is bacteria. And then eukaryotic cells, they are complex cells. They're much bigger. So remember, eukaryotic cells are 10 to 100 micrometers, whereas prokaryotic cells are 1 to 5 micrometers in size. They do have a nucleus. They do have membrane-bound organelles. And all of these here that are listed are membrane-bound organelles, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, all of those. So, well, cytoskeleton is not a membrane-bound organelle, but it plays a role there. So an example of a eukaryotic cell, plant cell, animal cell, any of those. And then things that they have in common. So remember I said all cells, regardless of whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes, are going to have a cell membrane. And I'm going to add this because I didn't write it in. It's going to have cytoplasm. And again, you'll see that sometimes referred as cytosol, which you'll see in some activities that we're going to do later. And they're all going to have ribosomes, because ribosomes, remember, are what are going to make protein. All right, so these are all things that they have in common. So cytoplasm, cell membrane, ribosome, and all of them are going to have some type of genetic information. For prokaryotic cells, we could add over here that it is single circular strand. All right, single circular strand. And then for eukaryotic cells, we have lots and lots of DNA inside of our nucleus. And remember, our DNA is in the shape of a double helix. So when we talk about cells, we also say unicellular and multicellular. So when I did the exploration of enzyme lab with you guys, I showed you basically how yeast react to hydrogen peroxide, and I said that yeast are unicellular organisms. So if you looked at a microscope slide of yeast, this is what you would see. Notice they are single-celled organisms. All right, each of these would be a cell that you would see. All right, so single-celled organism, and then other organisms are what we call multicellular, which means that they are made up of multiple cells, and we would be an example of an organism that is made up of many different cells. So multicellular organisms are cells that are, organisms that are made up of or many cells, and these cells are going to specialize in functions that they carry out. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this video because we will go into detail in a handout that I'm going to give you. So multicellular organisms, note that they are always eukaryotic cells. So what are some examples of specialized cells in a multicellular organism? This is a picture of some of the cells that you would see in your body. One here in this, there are two here in the center. Remember, we're all about classification of cells. So these are what we call our gametes, or our sex cells. So you have your egg cell, which is the female cell, and then you have the sperm cell, which is the male sex cell. And then you have red blood cells. So this is what red blood cells, if you look at them underneath of a microscope, and they are disc shaped because they need to be able to go through very small capillary tubes in your body. So that shape allows them basically to squeeze through those small spaces, and they're also designed to, because of their like concave structure here, the disc shape, it increases surface area so that it can bind to as much oxygen as possible, because remember, red blood cells are going to transport oxygen throughout your body. And then you have muscle cells. There are different types of muscle cells. As you see, this would be smooth muscle cells, so this would be what you would find on a lot of your organs. And then you have striated muscle cells that you're going to see in the muscles that you would use to move your arms and legs and things like that. And then bone cells, they look like this. Connective tissue, which would be your cartilage, collagen, all of those look like that. Nerve cells, that's not a very good picture of it. You'll see in the handout that I give you, they're designed to be able to communicate to lots of different cells. And then you have cells that are like this over here. This is what we call adipose tissue, and those are cells designed to hold basically fat for us. And we're going to look at how these cells are basically designed to carry out the function that they have. So multicellular organisms can have cells that specialize in a specific function, whereas unicellular organisms, that one cell is responsible for carrying out all of the different functions that is needed for the cell, whereas in multicellular organisms, they can have a division of labor, so no one cell gets stressed out, and also they have other cells to rely on. So they may have 1,000 adipose cells that if one happens to die or quit working, they have other cells to fall back on. Actually, it's probably more than 1,000. That was just an example of a number. So, main difference, again, unicellular, one cell does all the jobs, and prokaryotic cells, they are unicellular, so they're responsible for doing everything. So it puts a lot of stress on them to carry out all the functions. And then multicellular organisms are made up of many cells that are then specialized, or that specialize in different functions. And you're going to see the role that specialized cells carry out in a handout that I'm going to give you, and we're going to look at how they're designed to carry out the specific functions that they carry out. So type of cells, again, you can break them down into what you already heard me say are sex cells, which is our gametes. Those are cells that are responsible for basically our transmitting our DNA through basically reproduction. And then you have our somatic cells, which are basically all the cells in our body that are not sex cells. So your skin cells, your hair, your heart cells, all of those are what we call somatic cells. So somatic cells, what you need to know about those are what we call, diploid cells. What that means is that they have two sets of each chromosome. Remember, you got one set from mom and one set from dad. And in somatic cells, for humans, we have 46 chromosomes in our somatic cells. So mutations, if it happens in a body cells, that can impair normal cell growth and function, and it's primarily it is only seen in that particular individual. So if you have a mutation that happens in your somatic cells, you can't pass that down to your offspring because it happened in your body cells. However, if a mutation happens in your sex cells, you can pass that on to your offspring. So again, sex cells, you need to know the two types. You have, for females, it's an egg. For males, it's a sperm. And we refer to those as gametes. You'll also see them referred to as germline cells. There's a couple other names, but no, gametes are our sex cells, and they are what we call haploid, which means that they only have one set of each chromosome. And that's important because obviously the sperm cell and the egg cell are going to unite and create a zygote, which is a single-celled organism that's going to develop into a new living organism. So again, mutations that happen in sex cells can cause birth defects, and they can be passed down to their offspring. Alright, so things that you need to know from this video obviously are the two main categories of cells. So if you didn't do so, please go back and create a Venn diagram comparing and contrasting prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. You'll also want to compare and contrast plant cells and animal cells. So again, to review, plant cells have a cell wall, they have a large central vacuole, they have a chloroplasts or multiple chloroplasts, because remember they do photosynthesis and we do not, and their shape is traditionally square or rectangular because of the cell wall. And then animal cells, our cells are varied because we do not have that cell wall, and we do not have chloroplasts obviously. And animal cells, as I said, we have what are called centrioles, and centrioles are going to be used in cell division to create the mitotic spindle, and you'll see how that works in Unit 8. And then for animal cells, again, we have very small vacuoles, but we have numerous vacuoles in our cells. So compare and contrast plant cells and animal cells, and then you have to know the difference between sex cells and body cells are somatic cells. So remember, somatic cells are diploid, which means they have two sets for each set of chromosomes, and you need to know that the number of chromosomes for a human in our somatic cells, which are our body cells, are 46. And then for sex cells, they are haploid, which means they have one set of chromosomes, and the number of chromosomes in a sex cell is 23. And then you need to know egg and sperm are the two examples of our sex cells. And that basically concludes our overview of the different types of cells that you see. We will go into the different functions of organelles, how you can identify them in the cell, etc., in a video to come. And you'll also see a video on the compound light microscope so that you can be able to use that in the lab. So that concludes this video. Have a great day, everybody.